Hey all, this is probably my first PowerPoint I've ever recorded, lucky you guys, in this format. So hopefully me talking about these slides and drawing some pictures and helping you process the importance of the concepts we're about to talk about make this easier. If you are not currently at one of the computers in the classroom, if you're in class, if you're at home, do whatever you want. But if you're in class right now and there's a substitute and you're watching this, can you do me a favor and have them pause this or stop this? And I'd like you and your lab partner to actually go to one of the computers in my room and sit next to each other and work through it together. Both of you should take notes. Both of you are going to turn in flowcharts, but it's nice to have someone to process it with and work on it with. You should have already done or started your lab at this point. Just set it up. If you haven't, I suppose you could do it halfway through class or towards the end, and then continue working on these flowcharts as well. You will have 2 days to get through this if you're at home. Again, pick away at it as you want, but in theory, normally you should get through probably glycolysis and the Krebs cycle in the first day, and then the second day you'll probably have to do the electron transport chain in that flowchart, and you'll also work on the 7 deaths mystery. So let's get going. Okay, so what is cellular respiration, right? You're looking at this slide. It's described as a set of metabolic reactions and processes that take place in the cells of organisms to convert biochemical energy from nutrients into usable cellular energy and waste products. But what does that mean? Also, this equation should be moved up. If I could, I would. Right here, what's behind me in my weird face and recording is actually water, right? But you see that right here too. So what it is like photosynthesis, it's a step-by-step process of movement of energy and atoms and cycling to essentially dismantle glucose and turn it into ATP. Remember that photosynthesis was like small bits of energy that was used to eventually take CO2 out of the atmosphere and hydrogen and pull it together to make glucose to store it. And with this one, what you're doing is you're slowly dismantling and reusing enzymes and processes to pull apart glucose, C6H12O6, to turn it into ATP so that your cells can run and you can live. You'll see again glucose and oxygen, right? Those are the two inputs. These are the things that come out of photosynthesis. These are the things that go into cellular respiration. The two complement each other very well. And then you'll notice, right, energy released. When we talk about that with photosynthesis, there's energy going into it, and that sunlight. With cellular respiration, there's going to actually be ATP made over here that you're not seeing, but also there's heat energy being released. And you are a warm organism, and living organisms are warm compared to their environment, even if they're like cold-blooded. They're still warmer than their environment because of cellular respiration releasing heat. So cellular respiration, right? Like photosynthesis is all about plants using sunlight and oxygen, and carbon dioxide and water to make glucose. And then it's the baseline energy, chemical energy source for every organism on the planet. And so we care about photosynthesis for that reason. Also makes oxygen, also super important. Why do we care about cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is all about taking the energy we consume and turning it into energy that our cells can use. Great if you could eat a lot of glucose, but if you can't actually use it for your cells, if you can't make energy for your cells with it, then there's no point to that consumption. Remember, when we think about strategies for eating food, right, gaining glucose into our systems, we have heterotrophs and we have autotrophs. We are heterotrophs. We, other organisms. Plants are autotrophs. And it sounds like plants should be set with photosynthesis. They get energy from the sun and then turn it into glucose. Like, they're good, right? Why would they possibly need mitochondria? Why would they need to go through cellular respiration? Well, they need to go through it for the same reasons we do, to make ATP. And we talked a bunch about ATP at this point, but ATP is essentially the currency for your cells. And as photosynthesis takes sunlight, CO2, and water and turns it into glucose, cellular respiration, slowly dismantles glucose and turns it into usable energy for your cell, which is ATP. So, but think a little bit about this. Like, how did you make sure that you would have energy for today? Or what did you eat today? Or even last night if you're not a morning person, right? You consumed food. You ate food to make sure that you had energy, that your cells had energy. But I mean, sure, you're not thinking about that. I'm sure you're just trying to think of how to have a full stomach and how to have energy for the day. But it's really so that your cells can have that energy. What happens if you don't eat for a few days? Like, how do you start to feel? I'm sure a lot of you will feel kind of spacey, you feel kind of groggy, low energy, especially as growing teenagers, right? You need a lot of energy. You notice it, your cells notice it, your body starts to conserve processes because it needs the energy for crucial processes. What are some foods that give you quick energy besides caffeine? I think runners for a long time, right? They were all about eating like carbs, lots of carbs, so you could get right to the glucose, right to that, have high blood sugar, to have lots of blood sugar going through your body so you could make as much ATP as possible, which I don't know if they were connecting that, but they knew that they needed sugar and they knew they needed complex carbs to break down easily. And then how does your brain feel when you have not eaten food for a few days? If you haven't done that, if you haven't done a fast or just been in a situation where you couldn't get to food for a few days, it makes you feel pretty foggy, pretty hazy. Food is very necessary. But how does your body use food? Like what next? You eat it, goes into your tummy, breaks down, then what? Then what happens? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm hoping that by the end of this slideshow, this series of lessons, right, all kind of back to back with stops in between to make flowcharts, that you'll be able to, one, model the basic equation for cellular respiration. There's a really good chance you can do that now. It really is the reverse of photosynthesis, minus the sunlight. Two, connect photosynthesis and cellular respiration in an explanation. You've already kind of been asked to do that on your last test. You were asked to, why do plants need chloroplast and mitochondria? But think about that. Why do they need both? Think about the function of those organelles, and it will make sense too at the end of this. And then three, make flowcharts that show the movement of carbon and energy through the three processes of cellular respiration, very similar to the flowcharts that you've made with photosynthesis. And that's really the whole point of these, is for you to understand how energy moves through a cell and how your cell uses cycles and processes and enzymes to eventually break it down to make ATP so that your cell can function. So as another quick reminder, how are we, right? We are heterotrophs. How are we dependent on plants, autotrophs? We talked about that a little bit more. We talked about it a ton in photosynthesis. We require them as our baseline food source, right? Even if you don't eat vegetation, you eat animals that require vegetation. They're the bottom of the food chain in an important way. Also, we rely on them for oxygen, which is incredibly important as well. Photosynthesis is really important for food and for oxygen. Where does photosynthesis take place? In which organelle? It's green. You find it in plants. Hopefully you guys remember. Oh, this is going to be awful. Chloroplasts, right? So it takes place in the chloroplast, and we just did a whole week of talking about photosynthesis and chloroplast and movement through the chloroplast. Photosynthesis, remember, is basically taking the light energy and transferring that light energy into chemical bonds in the form of glucose for energy storage. But it stores energy, and then what? Again, like, it stores it into these cool chemical bonds in the form of glucose, and then there's energy storage, and then you go and you eat a whole bunch of apples, and then it goes into your body, and then what? What is the cellular process that allows you to utilize it? Well, the powerhouse of the organelles, or the powerhouse, of the cells, that's the one that helps us process it. Do you remember which one that is? Hopefully you do. That would be the mitochondria. So that's really what we're going to focus on when we talk about cellular respiration. So again, with photosynthesis, we're talking about the chloroplasts. But when we get into cellular respiration, we're jumping into the world of, I'm not going to finish it, the mitochondria. So let's just take a minute to look at those two equations, right? If we're connecting photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And also, if you might want to write down in your notes the equation for cellular respiration. You might want to draw this whole schematic, photosynthesis and how it's connected to cellular respiration. But one thing to note right off the bat, right, is photosynthesis, the inputs are CO2 and H2O and energy, right? And this, you guys know, this is sun energy. That's what goes out into photosynthesis, sun energy. Respiration, the outputs, right? These are the things that come out of it, are CO2, H2O, and energy. This second one, this is heat and ATP. It's not sun. We're done with sun. Sun's just photosynthesis. Sorry, this is the slowest thing ever. Heat and ATP, but the things that go into photosynthesis, you might want to write that in your notes and emphasize that the things that go into photosynthesis come out of cellular respiration. And the things that come out of photosynthesis go in to cellular respiration. So that's how they're connected. They're kind of like a cycle, right? One takes the waste products and makes the inputs of the next one. So the outputs of cellular respiration, when we pee and breathe on plants, we give them what they need to go through photosynthesis as long as there is light. And when they make glucose and oxygen, we take that in and turn it into energy and also CO2 and H2O. But the two are connected. So make sure you either draw the schematic or write down the equation for respiration and note that it is swapped for photosynthesis, or write them both down and just comment that the inputs are the outputs of the other one and the outputs are the input of the other one. But connect those, guys. It'd be the easiest way to explain how they're connected. So I'd like you to write this down in your notes too. It's kind of showing the basics of photosynthesis versus the basics of cellular respiration. You could make a Venn diagram out of it, but we'll just have some basic information that shows how they're connected and different. So again, photosynthesis makes glucose from light energy. Its general equation is 6H2O plus 6CO2 is 1C6H12O6, also known as glucose, and 6O2. And again, it requires sunlight, right? And that would be an input. You could say overall that photosynthesis is lots of cellular steps gathering and moving energy to make the glucose molecule. Without photosynthesis, we would have no glucose, no chemical energy, and no oxygen. Cellular respiration, on the other hand, breaks down glucose to make energy. So it takes glucose and oxygen and makes H2O, CO2, and what we're missing there is energy, which is ATP, and heat. There are lots of steps through this process of cellular respiration that slowly, like just in photosynthesis, it was slowly putting together the glucose molecule. Well, with cellular respiration, it's slowly and methodically and in a way that it's conserving as much energy as possible, dismantling the glucose molecule. So lots of steps that slowly pull energy from the glucose molecule. Without cellular respiration, we'd have no way of using glucose or chemical energy. So do plants have to go through cellular respiration? Yes. Do they have chloroplasts and mitochondria? Yes. So once again, we're going to be making flowcharts. Please make sure to take good detailed notes and draw pictures, right, of whatever schematics you see. I think that if you're doing a legit flowchart, you might have like this goes in this process, in this place. But if you want to do more of a diagram flowchart where you would draw parts of the mitochondria, for example, and show movement of electrons, right, flowing through, then you can go that way too. I think a lot of your brain works better in a more diagram model. But yeah, so go ahead and take good notes. And since it's a PowerPoint like this, where you can stop it and pause it, restart it, whatever you need to do, it's going to make your life a lot easier. And you're working with your partner this is really hard. So if I were you, I would make it a point to talk about it, to look it up and see what's going on. Not look it up, but like talk to each other about what you understand for each one. Also, this is a lot easier than photosynthesis. So it's difficult, but remember that like peak of difficulty that is photosynthesis. Cellular respiration tends to be a little easier for you guys because it's your second time learning a process like this. So just like before with photosynthesis, where you drew the chloroplast, I would really like you to draw the mitochondrion. I think mitochondria is plural. You can call it either. I don't care. But I want you to draw the different parts because we're going to talk about the different parts, and it'll be like your map navigating the different parts of cellular respiration. So go ahead, draw this little bean-like thing, right? It's been like sliced open so you can see the inside. You're going to really need to label the inner and outer mitochondrial membrane. You'll notice that the inner mitochondrial membrane is folded. Those are called cristae, those folds. Remember how with the thylakoid membrane, it was a bunch of like stacks of discs so that the thylakoid had lots of surface area? This is another way of having lots of surface area, is specifically, right, folding. That's why your brain has folds, is for lots of surface area. So go ahead though and label this bean. Outer membrane smooth, inner membrane has all these cristae, these folds. And then please make sure to note the mitochondrial matrix, which is like the cytoplasm in the middle of the mitochondria, or that you find in the middle of the cristae, essentially. Again, cristae and inner mitochondrial membrane, either way. So also make sure you write down that there are 3 parts to cellular respiration. First is glycolysis, super straightforward. We'll go through that one first. You guys have an easy time with it. At this point, I think you've already learned about fermentation as well. I think you did that lesson. You should have done that lesson. So for fermentation, right, so if glycolysis does not, if there's no oxygen, glycolysis doesn't need oxygen, but the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, they do. And if oxygen is not present, what actually happens is glycolysis goes to fermentation instead of going to the Krebs cycle. But again, you had a fermentation worksheet on that, and if you don't remember, you might want to go look over it again. But glycolysis is anaerobic, means it doesn't use oxygen, and it takes place in the cytoplasm, which is out here, right, outside of the mitochondria. If we have a cell, right, this is like an actual, we'll make it an animal cell. Here's our nucleus with our cytoplasm and our endoplasmic reticulums and our Golgi apparatus, right? Here's our mitochondria. We always draw the cristae now, the folds. We're talking here. This cytoplasm is where glycolysis takes place. So it doesn't even require the mitochondria, and it doesn't take place in the mitochondria. Also does not require oxygen. So if your body's under duress and you don't have enough oxygen, you can still run glycolysis. The Krebs cycle, on the other hand, it does require oxygen, and it takes place in the mitochondrial matrix. So in here, in the inside of the mitochondria. The electron transport chain, which is also an aerobic reaction, takes place on the inner membrane, so these folds, so these cristae, the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So both of these require oxygen, and they both require the mitochondria. This guy does not require the mitochondria, does not require oxygen. But go ahead and take a moment to write this stuff down and draw a lovely picture of your mitochondria. All right, so let's get going with the meat of, or really get into the details, for cellular respiration. So remember, take good notes so that you can easily do a flowchart for each section. So you also, right, can restart these videos as you need to if you need to watch them again for an explanation. Each of these have really good little flowcharts too. So our first step, we already talked about a little bit, is glycolysis. So this is the first step. So make sure you write that down. You're in the glycolysis section. Remember, this takes place in the cytoplasm. It does not require oxygen. The basic summary of glycolysis, as you can see here, is it takes glucose and it turns it into 2 3-carbon pyruvic acid molecules. You'll also see them called pyruvates. It's the same thing, but it splits it. That's what it does. It takes where you have 6 carbons, and it splits it into 2 separate molecules that are each 3 carbons. This happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, not in the mitochondria. When there's not enough oxygen present, it can also lead to fermentation, as we talked about before, and that's something you already looked at home. So this is the general outline of glycolysis, and then we'll get into more details on the next one, but that's generally the overview of glycolysis. So glycolysis is actually a really, really, really fast reaction, and I want you to write that down. If I were to ask you, like, which of our 3 steps of cellular respiration is the fastest, it's glycolysis by far. So it makes ATP the quickest, but it makes the least amount of ATP. You'll notice that, you'll see. So you might want to write that in your notes. It doesn't require oxygen. It's really fast. It doesn't require mitochondria, right? We've already gone over all of that. Happens in the cytoplasm, and it can make ATP really quickly, but it doesn't make a ton of ATP. That would be one of its downfalls. Again, we've already said this. It takes place without oxygen, and it happens in the cell cytoplasm, again, outside the mitochondria. It doesn't need mitochondria. I don't know why I just highlighted that like that. And it produces the least amount of energy of all. So here's the level of detail that you actually need to know for your flowchart. And this guy that you see here, it's okay. Like, this is an okay flowchart. It's okay. We'll say that's okay. But you could give more to it, right? You could say, like, it's a cytosol, which is another name for cytoplasm, but you could give a little more detail to it. But this is basically an appropriate flowchart for the most part. It's missing, like, where glucose is coming from, where the pyruvates go to, where the ATP goes to, where the NADH go to, where the ADP go to. So it's missing a bunch of stuff. But it's a good structure, basic structure, if you're making your glycolysis flowchart. So a glucose molecule, right, in glycolysis, we have this glucose molecule. This comes from the food you ate, right? You ate some food, it was delicious, your body breaks it down, puts glucose into your blood, so you have blood sugar that goes to your cells, goes into your cytoplasm, and then what happens in your cytoplasm is this 6-carbon sugar using enzymes, of course, that we're never talking about in the middle of all of this. So an enzyme is powered by 2 ATP, so you might want to write that down. To start this process, you actually need a glucose molecule, and you need 2 ATP to start it in the first place. It essentially gives the enzyme the energy to snap the glucose in half. So you have this glucose molecule coming in, you have 2 ATP coming into an enzyme, and it helps it power it to snap this in half. Now, when that glucose molecule breaks into 2, making these 2 pyruvates, it actually releases energy, and it releases electrons. So some of those electrons go on to these lovely electron carriers, NAD+. I wanted to say P, but there's no P in this one. That's photosynthesis, to make NADH. So this is the fully charged version, is NADH. This is the uncharged version, is NAD+. And you'll notice these protons are actually referring to floating hydrogen ions. So that's where the H comes from. So some electrons jump onto these guys. Then some of that energy and electrons that come from glucose power a synthase that charge 4 ATP. So you'll notice it takes 2 ATP, right, to start this process. And you end up with 4 ATP. So ultimately, you end up netting, if that makes sense. So you have a net gain of 2 ATP. So the 2 pyruvates are what are the result of this whole process. The whole point of glycolysis truly is to give your cell a little bit of energy, for sure, in the ATP, but is mainly to break the glucose into 2. And then where the pyruvates go is they go on to the Krebs cycle, which is in the mitochondria. So they leave and they go to the Krebs cycle, and that is in the mitochondria. The ATP, they go off to wherever they're needed, anywhere that needs energy. The NADH, they actually go on to the electron transport chain, and that's also in the mitochondria. Whoa, that E was ridiculous. And then these guys, they go back to get recharged later down the line. So when you go to make your flowchart, you need to consider all of this. I do want you to know that overall, 1 glucose goes in, 2 pyruvates go out. 1 glucose go in and charges, right? 2 NADHs that go to the electron transfer chain in the mitochondria, and 4 ATP that go wherever they're needed in the cell. 2 pyruvates, again, I know I've said that already, that go to the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria. And to do this whole process in the first place, the enzyme that helps split the glucose requires 2 ATP. And these can go back to be charged again. And the last thing I want to mention, you might want to just put a little side note. If there is not enough oxygen, right, what's going to happen is these pyruvates are actually going to go into fermentation. And you can't live off fermentation, but fermentation is your body's way of trying to give you a little more energy when your oxygen is low. Okay, again, just as a reminder, you have a 6-carbon sugar that comes in, right? Glucose. It's come from whatever food you ate the night before. An enzyme that needs 2 ATP to charge it comes in and actually splits the glucose. So this ends up making 2 pyruvates. There's actually all these like subcategories of what's made, but again, for the sake of this biology class, we don't go too into detail. So it makes 2 pyruvates, and they go on, these both go on, to the Krebs cycle. Oh gosh. As this splits, right, it takes 2 ATP to do this. This releases energy and electrons. And what the cell does is it takes those electrons to turn 2 NAD pluses into NADH, 2 NADHs, and they go on to the ETC, right? And that is in the mitochondria. This energy helps charge 4 ADP. I hate that you can hear my mouse so much. I need to work on getting a pen to make 4 ATP. And those go wherever they're needed in the cell. Okay, I hope that helped. So go ahead and rip out a piece of paper, and you and your partner can talk about this. I actually don't care if they look similar, if you've worked on it and collaborated and helped each other, because ultimately that's probably what's going to happen. Your drawing should be slightly different, but you're going to make your first flowchart. And remember, this isn't really in order. It shouldn't be mitochondria first or whatever. That's probably last what you're going to go to when you talk about Krebs cycle and ETC. And ETC again stands for electron transfer chain. Really, remember in photosynthesis, you always start with the sun. Well, with this guy, you actually should start with glucose. That's what you should start with. Always. Everything with cellular respiration, start with glucose, because glucose is the initial start of glycolysis, and glycolysis is the beginning, right? You eat food so you can get glucose, and then glucose goes into your cells, and then it starts this whole pathway that leads to ATP production. You'll notice oxygen is in there, but this doesn't require oxygen. So you would know, doesn't require oxygen, and that's what makes it anaerobic. You don't have to say that oxygen is being used. You would say it's not being used specifically, or the lack of oxygen is part of the characteristics. But please make sure to make a nice, concise flowchart. You don't have to add color. Make sure your name's on it and turn it in. Make sure everything's in there. Again, you can work with your lab partner. You should be at a computer with them right now anyways, if you chose to work with someone. Should be your assigned lab partner. But you each need to make your own flowchart. When you're done with that, go ahead and move on to the next section. You still need good notes for this. Make sure you get them. And I think that's it.